these are real risks. But, being able to at least ask those questions and decide, do you want that life is really important, because as you said, sometimes we wake up and realize we're living a lie. We don't actually want the life that we've created.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Nourished Inside Out. I am here with Marcus today, and he's a student therapist. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the chance to be on.
Absolutely. Do you mind telling us a little bit about your background and your journey as a student therapist?
So I guess a little bit of history about me is I, of course, like most therapists, I would imagine, really had a value for people and relationships. And I think to me, that was really noticeable for quite some time, and trying to build a career on that can be kind of hard in a world that doesn't always value that. And so I originally went into my psychology undergrad a bit later in life, in my early 20s. And I originally wanted to go into business psychology, but then quickly shifted over after getting some experience working with at-risk youth, and realized that there's a lot of meaning and purpose and a lot more fulfillment for me personally working in that area when you're talking about like real trauma and real situations and real relationships, not just, what happens at work. And so I switched my intention away from, being in business psychology over to doing real actual therapy and wanting to be a psychologist here in Calgary, Alberta, and have been on my journey since. And now I'm in my practicum, meeting clients and meeting with my supervisor, and yeah, really just cutting my teeth in the field.
I think that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. From previous conversation that we had, you talked a little bit about identity shaking. Can you tell us what it means to experience an identity shake and how it can impact someone's sense of self-worth?
Yeah, I think when we spoke, I mean, your audience knows about your story, and you mentioned, your history with your divorce. And I think that really resonated with me, because I know that when you have these really big climactic moments, whether they're, happening in a few hours or, over the span of years, there's things that happen that change us. And there's these moments where we reflect back and realize that who we are is fundamentally, or what happens to us is fundamentally changing who we are. When I think about that, I think about incorporating different, sort of mechanisms, skills, values, beliefs in these changes that are happening. There's a level of continuity where who we are is consistent over time, but there's also a level of change where we can look back, some of us as short as 6 months, and realize we are not the same person. Who we were before this event is completely different. And that's where I characterize that as an identity shift, where, people experience these really significant and clear changes in their life based on what they're experiencing. And sometimes that could be a bad thing. We have experiences that shape us in a negative way, that kind of tear us down and can really be harmful and take us to not great places. And that can be a different identity shift. But there's also, of course, the beautiful aspects of, I've experienced something really hard and challenging, and I've overcome it. And not only did I overcome it and come to the other side of it, but I've become somebody stronger, better, somebody I feel more proud of. And we have a new sense of who we are based on the things that we've experienced, that really builds from a sense of confidence, knowing that we've faced challenges and we will overcome them, and we can overcome similar difficulties, builds a level of resiliency and confidence in who we are that we can then take into the rest of our lives.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. How do major life changes, like for example, moving, career shifts, or breakups, how can they affect our sense of identity?
That goes back to like, it can go positive or negative. Unfortunately, I mean, there's a lot of times, and, scrolling on social media, where as I look at people who have experienced breakups or who have experienced really bad heartbreaks, you hear the challenges of people who say, I don't want to love anymore. I don't want to be vulnerable anymore. I don't want to be open anymore. And these are really difficult potential stages or potential life identity changes, where people are trying to make sense and trying to really adapt to their experiences. And it's really hard. It's really, really hard. We take on these different beliefs and values that might be detrimental to us in our well-being, not believing in love, having hope, not believing in romance. And optimism can take people to obviously really dark places, and they cut out people. They don't really believe in companionship. They don't really believe in strong communities. They don't believe in others. And that will weigh you down. That's just something where if you think that the world is on your shoulders, that's a really hard reality to live with. That's where you have a pretty difficult negative identity shift that will likely cause problems in the future. You're not able to have connections. You're not able to form friendships and have meaningful relationships. Life is kind of robbed of its energy and vitality with that sort of mentality. And that can be really hard. And in the same way, and the opposite end, you also have really positive identity shifts where, you enter a new career and this career aligns with your values. It aligns with who you are. And not only do you feel more embodied to who you are and the work that you're doing, but you're learning and you're growing and you're becoming somebody that you feel proud of and that you're excited to continually learn about. And you have a huge identity shift within a career. You're just really proud of who you are. You're proud of the skills that you're developing. And you look back after 1 year in the job, 3 years in the job, 5 years in the job, and you realize, wow, I've come so far. I'm a very different person, but I'm incredibly well versed in this field, in this industry, and I'm doing a lot of good that means a lot to me. And it's fulfilling. And you have that sense of fulfillment that makes you a better person that you can then take your confidence, your skills, your strategies, your abilities, and lend them to other people to add value and make the world a better place. And obviously, both of these experiences can happen in the inverse. You can have a positive relationship, romantic relationship that builds you up, and you can have a career change that tears you down as well. And so, there's no saying like, these are negative experiences, these are positive experiences. It really depends on how your story unfolds.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. For somebody who has a negative identity at the moment and they want to work on building more of a positive identity, what are some tips or things that you would recommend for them to do to start building more positive habits?
That's a bit tough because, I think part of me as putting the therapist hat on,
Yeah.
the reason that therapy can be a slow process is because there's a lot of information and a lot of context to everyone's stories. So the idea of, I like, even for me sitting in session, like it's very rare for me to start giving advice or offering reframing perspectives or really expecting any sort of change in that first session because there's so much context to people's stories, so many different variables of what matters to them and things that are negotiable, non-negotiable, and you really have to lay out those pieces. I'm a bit reluctant to give general advice, but at the same time, I would say, if somebody is stuck in like a negative identity place and they realize maybe they don't like who they are, maybe they don't like where they're at, they don't like how they behave, they're not really proud of the actions that they've taken, it's really no different than really just taking assessment, first of all, of what are you not happy with? What are you not proud of? What things do you do in your daily life that actually, don't bring you joy and, you know, potentially give you a negative outlook of yourself? And when you understand those things, you can actually then at least one potentially stop and try to minimize those behaviors. And at the same time, a lot of times you can understand who we are and what brings us life by understanding what takes it away. And so the things that violate our boundaries or violate our values are areas where we can understand that we have on the other side really strong values for those things. And then in the same way we're taking assessment of what's taking away our energy, what's taking away our life, you can start adding to, well, if that's getting taken away, how do I add more to that? How do I create space for that? And that's going to be different for everybody. I'm in a big city of about 1.2 million people. The idea of giving advice, of exploring, clubs and networks and going to shows doesn't exist for somebody in rural America who doesn't have access to that. And so it's going to look way different. And so it's really just understanding what are the ways that you can, quote unquote, feed yourself? How do you nourish yourself? How do you give back to yourself? So that way, you know, you're positioning yourself to really be encouraged and energized through the environment and the experiences that you're having.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. I think a lot of times it's also the environment because, like you were just saying, if somebody is in a big city versus like a rural town, it's completely different on how the journey would look like. But it also stems back to nourishing yourself from the inside out, honestly. I told you a little bit about how I was in my last relationship and it was really unhealthy because I
Yeah.
wasn't taking care of myself from the inside out. And
Right.
I could totally agree with that. It always starts within. Just start small, whether it's going for a walk, adding more mindfulness into your day, or even just eating more nutritious food. It all just starts with
Mhm.
in time.
I'm very, when you start studying the brain and psychology and you start realizing like how powerful these simple quote unquote basics are, you'd be astounded. Do you get exercise? Do you get good sleep? And do you have good food? And are you surrounded by good people? Even before you're getting into mental health disorders and mental health challenges, those four pillars are absolutely monumental, because without any one of those, somebody could be, as you said, like unnourished and having some really debilitating and crippling experiences. And it's not necessary to really diagnose any sort of mental health disorder, or say that person's chronically challenged. It could be as simple as filling in the basics. The basics are really important.
Yeah, and even things simple as just like hydrating, drinking water. It's amazing how like sometimes I can feel disconnected or distracted, and then I drink more water and all of a sudden it makes sense again. Also, something that I wanted to dive into a little bit are personality disorders. Do you mind telling us some common misconceptions about personality disorders?
Yes, this is a very taboo topic, I think, especially nowadays, as I think things like narcissistic personality disorder have really caught in traction in the more mainstream sort of narratives on social media and things. So when you look at personality disorders, they're exceptionally rare. They're a person's ex or a person's parent very like is probably much more likely to have narcissistic traits than to actually be diagnosed with a narcissistic personality disorder. And same thing with psychopathology. We're talking about 1% or less than 1% of the population for, each of these personality disorders or so. For at least those two common ones, I want to spread a word of caution. I think that's usually my passion point, because personality disorders are really lifelong and pretty chronic. And so the idea of somebody being quote unquote healed from a personality disorder is very difficult, because personality is thought to be this thing that lasts a lifetime. It's thought to last beyond context and beyond situation, and be present throughout the lifespan. And so labeling somebody a narcissist or a psychopath, those kind of terms, what you're really doing is putting a label on somebody that says that they can't change. And if that is the case, I don't know if that's true or not. I would never say that somebody is or is not a narcissist or a psychopath. That's not my place. That's not anybody's place.
Mhm.
But putting that label on somebody is really difficult, because if you do, what you're really saying in your own conceptualization of that problem is that person's not going to change. That person can't change, which then immediately puts you in a really difficult position of, well, if you have no external influence, you're left in a place of potentially being in a really vulnerable position to make really drastic decisions. Really, the question then becomes, are you willing to put up with it or not? Or are you going to cut this relationship out entirely? These are really big questions and really difficult sort of responses, compared to, okay, I'm in a relationship and it feels like my partner's being incredibly selfish. That's different, because there's still the capacity to work on things, to have a sense of optimism. Whereas when you have personality disorders, those sort of outlooks become much more bleak.
That's really interesting how you said that it's really rare to have a personality disorder, because I think a lot it's so easy to just label things right off the bat.
Yeah.
But if you're saying it's something rare, if I guess I never thought about it from this perspective, but it's a personality that's tied to you forever. So if you're just labeling someone, oh, they have this personality disorder, it kind of seems like you're saying they have that forever, like what you just mentioned. So it's totally validating. It's not forever. There could be traits of a personality disorder, but it's not lifelong.
No. And that's the thing, like, that's another passion point as well. When you're talking really about any sort of diagnosis and disorder, a lot of times we feel that we need language to be validated by other people. And so we'll use something like, narcissistic personality disorder, depression, anxiety, all of these labels that help us understand one another's experiences. It's helpful, and it creates language, to really simple language to let ourselves be understood and potentially validated by other people. But the downside with that is, these labels come with really powerful weights. You're talking about really problematic problems, and depressive feelings are not the same thing as having depression. Having anxiety is an emotion that everyone feels. That doesn't mean you have anxiety as a disorder. And again, slapping a really big label on it can be really detrimental, because if you, go in and say, I think I have this, I'm self-diagnosed, have as having anxiety, how you manage yourself and what you choose to believe about yourself and how you operate in the world is going to change drastically, and potentially make it seem like you don't have the capacity to, endure and manage what's going on in your internal world and in your environment. And that's a really difficult place to be. And that's where I become a bit more compassionate and understanding that one of my favorite professors talked about you don't actually need a label on a disorder to be validated. Ideally, you're surrounded by people who love you, believe you, validate you, and want to understand you. And whether it's someone in your life who has narcissistic traits or your feelings of depression or symptoms of ADHD, maybe you don't need a label. Maybe you just need to be surrounded by people who actually want to understand and believe you and can help meet you where you're at. A lot of times that can be enough.
Yeah, it's totally creating that safe space. I think the most important thing is us as humans, whether it's friends, family members, or like an outside community, is creating a safe space for people to feel and be who they want to be and let
Yeah.
them figure it out. Because I think a lot of times, if we're growing up and we have these expectations from family members or the friends around us, you're striving to be somebody that you don't even want to be. And it creates these habits and these actions upon yourself that it's not even you. So I think one of the most valuable things is just creating a safe space to let people be who they are.
Yeah. Which is really difficult. And I'm sure we can all attest that, being able to be authentic, to show up honestly and openly and vulnerably feels like a bit of an uphill battle nowadays with call it social media and comparison and globalization, but there's so many more expectations. It feels like so many the measurement and the standard feels so much more clear that we have to measure up to, which then of course we all internalize and we feel that we have to do these things. I have to go to college after high school. I have to be married by my late 20s. I have to have a kid right after that. I have to have a house by this point. And these internalized expectations really create a lot of friction because a lot of us never stop to think and ask ourselves, do I actually even want these things? And they may not even be as big as marriage or kids, even something as simple as like a job. Do I actually like this job? Do I actually like what I'm doing? Do I want to do this? And we might spend, 1, 5, 10 years in a career. And before we realize I'm really exhausted and burned out. Why? You don't even like what you do for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's tough. That's exhausting.
There's a lot of expectations based on we should have this done by this age. We should have this done by this age. And that's honestly how I felt too when I was 20. I don't know why, but I thought I was just looking at my parents' generation. I was like, oh, well, they met, they got married at 22. They're great. I was always looking at that as like an example. So then I found myself 21 and I was in a relationship. Yeah, it sounds normal to get married. But then I was in it and I was like, this is not what I want. And it was creating me to be a person I didn't want to be. So
Yeah.
it's totally valid. My
Yeah.
actions, my words, where I was living, thankful for it all, but it wasn't who I wanted to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially like I love that you brought up parents because of course when you talk about therapy, like it's a whole big thing. I think all parents have obviously a lot of times good intentions for their kids, and we learn who we are and how to navigate the world through our parents. And the unfortunate thing is now the world is moving fast, very, very fast. Our parents likely didn't have the internet growing up. And the world that they lived in and the normal world that they lived in is completely different than the normal world we live in and the normal world that, the next generation is going to live in. A big thing for me is I was under the impression of, oh, I need to go to university, I need to go to school. This is what success means. And while I appreciate my education, I'm very thankful and I needed it to become a therapist. There's so many people where a university education, especially in the States, that's costing tens of thousands of dollars a year is not a way to actually build success because you might not even like anything. Maybe you want to go to the trades. Maybe you want to be a handy person and you like working with your hands, and you're not going to get that potentially in a university setting that's more theoretical and more cognitive and more abstract. And the same thing with the friends and internet. We think that our parents set the standard, as you said, with relationships that I need to get married young. That's what people do. You get married at 24. The rate and age of average marriage is rising like pretty steadily, higher and higher. People are getting married later and later. And as we know in common narratives, people are having less and less kids. Where it was more common to have 2, 3, 4 kids, people are having 1, 2, if any. Like ideas of what's expected of us can be so internalized. And like, I don't know who your audience and listener base is, but I think, between the ages of 16 to 24 are really pivotal because these are the ages and the stages where you really get to start reflecting and questioning, what are you looking for? What do you want? What's expected of you? And do you actually want to fulfill those expectations? Because maybe you might not want to, and that's going to cause a major rift. Your parents might be upset with you. And in some families, even your parents might cut you out. These are real risks. But, being able to at least ask those questions and decide, do you want that life is really important because, as you said, sometimes we wake up and realize we're living a lie. We don't actually want the life that we've created.
Yeah, that's so true. How can somebody set boundaries with the people around them, whether it's friends or family members, who have an expectation of them to live this life or accomplish these things, even though it's not what that person wants?
I would say the big thing is boundaries are for you. They're not against somebody else. And it's a common misconception. It's what separates boundaries from ultimatums. You're not saying, I'm going to retaliate if you do this. That's not what boundaries are. Boundaries are you being able to express and identify, this is how much I can love you and myself at the same time without it compromising either one of us. That's what boundaries are. In order to make boundaries, and in order to actually articulate them and formulate them, that means you actually have to understand yourself and have some self-reflection of, what's your capacity? What do you have the means to do? What do you have the capability to do? How can you show up for the people around you? But then also reckon and your values of, what do you want to do? What are you committed to doing? But then also understanding, how much are you willing to meet somebody else where they're at? How much are you willing to actually tolerate and endure difficult circumstances with others? And again, this is where it becomes really person specific, really context specific. Again, different cultures, different religions, different families have different expectations. Some families are super independent. Everyone's doing their own thing, and that's okay. In other families, if you deviate from the family career, that is absolutely detrimental and could get you cut out of a will. There's no one size fits all, but understanding your own values and the cost that you're willing to endure. And I think that means it's really important that, success might not mean I'm living 100% authentically and I'm making sure my family and my parents can quote unquote put up with that. It's more so of what's worth sacrificing. And for some people, maybe it is a career. Maybe it is saying, I'm okay to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, to still have a relationship with my parents because I actually don't care about my job that much. I can clock in at 9, I'll clock out at 5, maybe even 3 if I get high enough in the corporate ladder and I have less responsibilities or whatever, and I have the clout to do that. But what I'm not really willing to sacrifice is the relationship with my dad. These are very real choices. These are very real, sort of variables in the situation that help us shape and define how we want to live. But you can't do that if you don't take inventory of yourself. And that includes both strengths of, again, your capacity and your capabilities, and also understanding your limitations. What are you just not willing to live with? What can you not live with? What is really difficult to endure? And what are you actually hoping to prohibit in these boundaries? Because knowing that if you keep living with it and keep enduring it, it's going to tear you down. These are the kind of questions that really help you articulate and say, hey, I really appreciate how much you care about my family. I plan on having kids, but I'm going to do that on my timeline. I really appreciate if you, stop asking. I know you mean well, but it just doesn't feel good to me.
Yeah, I think those are all validating points and great pointers. I really like what you said is that boundaries are for you and they're not to hurt other people. They're honestly just to protect your peace. And it also helps you have more healthier relationships from the people with it. I think it's beautiful. What are some red flags that indicate a lack of respect for boundaries in a relationship?
That's a bit tough. It's tough because I'm really biased in my career as a student therapist, and then also throughout my education. I'm well versed in the complexities of humans. I wouldn't say I'm an expert by any means, but being able to hold space for so many different realities. And that's the difficulty. Is a lot of times when we hear on social media and scrolling through, it's like, if someone doesn't show you the respect that you deserve, drop them, end it, cut them off. I empathize with that take a lot because, of course, we are worth protecting. We are worth, managing our space and our experiences. Absolutely. And at the same time, everyone who breaks a boundary or, treats us in a way that we don't really appreciate might not come from a place of ill will. It might come from a place of a lack of their own emotional development. It's really difficult to hold space for somebody else if you don't know how to do that with yourself. It's really difficult to honor somebody else's word if you don't honor your own and you think, your commitments are fickle. And so I would say, first and foremost, you really have to take inventory and try to really have empathy for the other person of what is their capacity. And I'm speaking so apprehensively because there's many situations where it's like, oh, my parents, don't respect my boundaries. And it's like, your parents were abused by your grandparents and your dad could like have alcoholic tendencies or your mom could have alcoholic tendencies. It's not as simple to say, oh, they're breaking your boundaries, cut it off. It's not this black and white thing because again, these are our parents or these are our family members. These are our longtime friends. It comes into the play of what can you endure? Where are you at in your journey? What can you tolerate? And what's actually like really suffocating you that's compromising your own self-respect to a really significant degree. Being able to take inventory of those things can really help us understand and help us articulate again, I love this person in my life. They're really special to me, but I'm realizing the pain is becoming too great. And I realize I'm not respecting myself staying here. And maybe it's not cutting them off entirely. Maybe it's having a different idea of how do you shift that relationship? Can you talk to them less? Can you go to less family gatherings? Manage the relationship differently instead of a different context? This is where nuance is really important in this because the narratives, again, are so intense and so polarizing of how to manage these things of just endure, believe, have hope, have faith, love, that can feel like self-harm. It can feel like we're really denying ourselves. And you do that for so long, you're going to internalize that and you're going to find yourself in a really dark place where you don't trust yourself. That's really difficult. And at the same time, if you cut out anybody and everybody who's disrespecting a boundary, you're going to be alone. And it's going to be, again, really hard to, again, feeling as though you have this sense of self-respect and protection, but at the same time, you didn't have the grace and compassion and understanding to make space for other people. And that's also going to be a tough place to be.
I think that's really validating and it's great advice because I remember like I used to like cut people off all the time, just left and right. And I didn't respect my boundaries or values didn't align. But something that I've been learning is don't cut them off, just love them from a distance. You don't have to talk to them every day. Check in once in a while. Hey, how's it going? If there's disrespect, then tell them. But at the same time, you can keep people around, your friends, your family members, but just love them from a distance. It's more humbling and it's gives you a lot more compassion for others, especially
Yeah.
because if they don't understand your boundaries, then it's okay.
There's like a misconception that you have to communicate your boundaries. Your boundaries are for you. And so, if you have an acquaintance or someone you cross paths with and like you don't get a good feel and they don't treat you the way you want to be treated, it's not like you have to like go up to everybody who, shows you a level of disrespect or just treats you in a way that you're not satisfied with. Declare these sort of changes. It's an adaptation for you too. Maybe you just don't hang out with that person as much. That's okay. They don't need to know that. And that's where it's like there's a weaponization of boundaries that's really harmful. When somebody's used to people pleasing or, being in this mode of accommodating others so much of their life, you learn about boundaries, you learn about self-empowerment, you learn about protecting yourself and taking inventory of where you're at. And the risk is people can start to weaponize boundaries not realizing they're making it into ultimatums. They're making it into, I'm trying to control my external world. I'm trying to control other people. And it's like, that's not what boundaries are for. Boundaries are for you. There's some instances where you don't even need to communicate them. Maybe it's just calling that person less, spending less time in this space. That's it.
That's so true. What's the difference between a healthy compromise and overstepping personal boundaries?
The difference between a healthy compromise and overstepping personal boundaries, I would say the difference would be how much does this compromise mean to you and how impactful is it in the moment? And then also how impactful is it going to be in the long term? Making a compromise in the moment and saying, yeah, in this moment, I don't need to be the center here. I don't need to have my choice be chosen here. That's okay. And it doesn't always feel good. And sometimes it feels like a big sacrifice. And that's like, okay, that sucks. But I'm willing to do that because I care. And love can cost me something. And that's okay. It actually is an affirmation that I care because I'm willing to pay something to show my love for somebody else. Great. Where that becomes problematic is, are we actually denying who we are? Are we beginning to compromise our sense of self or these aspects that we really cherish about ourselves, even if that's something as small as like lifestyle or, how you spend your money, you know, those are the things where it's like, oh, over the long run, that becomes problematic. That becomes really difficult. And that's where you can have these really unfortunate, rightfully so, feelings of resentment or bitterness or anger start coming up because even though you're the one choosing to compromise and you're the one choosing to give it away, you're resenting the other person because at some point you're expecting that they're going to open the door and deny your offer when in reality that's not their job. It's our job to manage our own boundaries. Over compromising is when it starts to come at our detriment and it starts to not only impact us in that moment, but over the long term where we're uncomfortable with what that person continually tries to take from us. And that's where we're disavowing our own sense of self for this other person. And that's not helpful. And that's not love. Love doesn't mean we're a martyr. Self-sacrificing to that extent is not love because love is about having a connection between multiple parties. If you're putting yourself on the altar to be, executed and you think that you can't have an opinion, what connection is there? There's no connection because what you're really doing is accommodating to somebody else. So you're really building a world that's actually centered around one person. That's not love. That's not connection. That's not two people who are seeking understanding and knowing each other. That's, again, gets into like that people pleaser territory.
I really like how you said that it becomes a problem when when you're no longer comfortable. They're still overstepping or taking advantage of your kindness or the things that you do for them to the point where it makes you feel uncomfortable. So I think that's also like a really healthy boundary as well. Because it's
Mhm.
important to be there for people and to be there for others. But once it's no longer comfortable, that's a really great point.
It's pretty as straightforward as consent, right? If my friend has a flat tire down the road and they're calling me to help change it because it's raining and that's going to be really uncomfortable. But I'm consenting. I want to do that. And it's going to cost me something that's okay. It's much different when I'm giving and I might be saying yes, but internally I know I'm not consenting. That's not love.
Absolutely. So, kind of diving into the love languages, I'm sure you're familiar with them. How, how do they relate to setting boundaries in relationships, and how important are they to know your love language and the other person you're with?
This is a big thing in the therapy and relationship community. I don't want to get on my soapbox for too long. I want to say first and foremost, if somebody gets value out of the love languages, awesome, take it. If it's helping you, run with it. I would never tell somebody to not have something that they found as a resource that's helped and changed the relationship for the better. If it works, awesome. At the same time, the love languages are very controversial because they were founded and not actually based on reputable empirical studies and science. And so while it's helpful, there's no real evidence that shows that responding based on love languages is a key change for relationships. Whether it's physical touch, words of affirmation, acts of service, these are things that we all need to different degrees. And so while something might mean more to us and we're trying to communicate that to our partner, oh, I need a hug. A hug makes me feel regulated and I feel comforted and I really need that. And that means a lot to me. I actually don't care. What you're doing in that moment is less love languages and more of just actually having a bid for connection. And that's what, when we look at relationship science and the data and all of the studies that are going on, that's what really determines how healthy a relationship can be is are you able to offer bids of connection and is your partner actually able to turn into those? Are they responding to those? Are they attuned to those? Those are the key concepts. And it doesn't matter if it's a hug and physical touch. It doesn't matter if it's dinner and acts of service, whatever. It's really more, am I able to communicate and let my partner know what I'm needing? And is my partner able to make space for me, value my needs, and respond? That is the key kind of unlock. And that's where love languages can get really quickly washed away because it's actually not about these specific five. Do you feel valued by your partner? Are they able to be attuned to you and hear you and understand what you're needing and learn how you operate and incorporate that into their life to show that they value you to a very high degree? And is your partner able to listen and take that in and express that when asked for? That's going to be much more telling of a satisfying relationship.
That's beautifully said. In previous relationships, I would actually take those really serious. These are my love languages. And then you take the quiz. And I think it's great to know because it gives you more awareness about yourself and the other person. But like you said, don't base the relationship off of that. What's more
Mhm.
important is, does the person value you enough to adjust some of their daily habits for you and vice versa?
Yeah. Yeah. And in the same way, like, again, I wouldn't say throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. I know for me personally, you know, I'm a very sort of intimate talker. I love deep conversation and connection. It really reflects just how we conceptualize love and connection. For me, I value physical touch, but to a much lesser degree because, I feel like in my experiences, I know what it's like for people to express touch but not have connection and to not have love. And so for me, in my definitions and formulations of love and connection, that just means less because and that's not to say that, something like sex doesn't matter at all. It's just varying degrees of, how we see the world, how we view love. And again, that's where it's important of understanding your partner. How do they view love? What do they need? What are they looking for? How did they grow up? What was their experiences that shaped how they define love? We think of love as this universal experience when in reality it means so much for different people. Some people think love is living in a cabin with their partner and a dog and being quiet in their own little space and looking each other in the eye for 15 hours a day, and that's amazing for them. Whereas for other couples, the idea of that sounds horrendous, and love looks like spontaneity and novelty every single day. They want to go out, they want to experience things, they want to get their blood going together. That's love. And that's where we have to understand that what we see, don't get into this comparison game of like, oh, this person has this, but what does it actually even matter to you? Do you want that? And then we can create a life of, no, I want this kind of love. This is the love that matters to me. And it helps us then choose a better partner, choose a lifestyle, and choose a relationship that aligns with who we are, that is going to make us happy, not, be a good picture for the gram.
Can understanding our partner's attachment style help rewire negative patterns in the brain?
Absolutely. With my own values and my own modality and theory that I like to base my practice off of, I'm heavily attachment based. And that is also based on my experience working with youth and seeing how attachment both positively and negatively forms within children and seeing the dynamics play out throughout their teenage years. Learning and understanding how attachment is like wired within a person really can be extremely illuminating to understanding the person in front of us and understanding how we can love them. If somebody's anxious, the thoughts, the feelings, and their experiences and their way of connecting is going to look a lot different than somebody who's avoidant or secure. That's just data and stats. We know that. We're very confident in that. Understanding attachment is incredibly, incredibly helpful to relationships.
How does practicing mindfulness impact the brain and improve relationship dynamics?
I would say for one, this is even my own experience, but being in the psych world and kind of understanding, I started practicing mindfulness because I thought I was aware of the benefits it had for focusing and for productivity. So I didn't have this idea of, having some sort of spiritual transcendence within mindfulness. I just wanted to do more. It's also very clear mindfulness is allows you to focus and allows you to, yes, be more productive, but it's this ability to be present and it's this ability to actually acknowledge what is and accept what is without judgment, which is a really powerful skill. So many times in life when we have feelings that we're not comfortable with and experiences that are stressful, the first thing we want to do is grab our phone, and we just want to disengage from these experiences in our bodies and the emotions that we're naming within ourselves and the implications that we're picturing in our head of what this means. And, we'll doom scroll to try to get away from this. Whereas with mindfulness, it's really helpful to actually just learn to like sit with that emotion, to acknowledge it, and to recognize without judgment, this is where I'm at. That's really powerful because, and a lot of times, we have an emotion, we have an experience, we have a feeling, we're like, change it. You can, and you can do something with it. Absolutely. But, emotions and feelings and our experiences can be fixed, but they're not something to be fixed. You are not something to be fixed. Your emotions are not something to be fixed. They're just experiences. And it's your body's way of trying to tell you something. It's your brain's way of trying to make sense of what's happening. And so even in relationships, the ability to be mindful is really helpful because there's going to be moments that are uncomfortable. There's going to be moments that are challenging, that are stressful. And so being able to sit in those moments without judgment, when your partner is giving you negative feedback about yourself that you don't like to hear, being able to be mindful and say, okay, they're saying something about me that I don't like, that feels really uncomfortable. I'm going to sit with this discomfort and I'm going to really not try to judge that. I'm not going to be defensive. I'm not going to try to make excuses, but let me just sit. That's holding space for somebody. That is being loving towards somebody to say, I see that. And that's really uncomfortable. And that mindfulness skill allows you then to not only receive it, but then to step into the other person's experience and go one step further and say, yeah, I can take accountability for that. I can recognize the impact I had on you. You're right. And I'm sorry. That was not my intention, but that doesn't matter. My intention for you is to have these experiences, and I'm willing to make changes so that way you don't have to experience that negative situation again. Mindfulness is a really good skill because it builds patience and it builds compassion and empathy in a relationship.
That's so beautifully said. Thank you for sharing all of that. So before we go ahead and wrap this up, can you tell us where can people find you and where can they support you?
I'm on just basically every social media platform, although my content can be a bit sporadic. So I'm on TikTok under The Realist Therapist. I'm on Instagram under The Realist Therapist. Google The Realist Therapist. That's kind of like my tagline I came up with in undergrad. I just love feedback. If there's topics or situations that people need help with or want clarity on, for me being in the field, like I've been learning about psychology for quite a long time. And so for me, sometimes it's easy to forget with what somebody who's not in the psychology space doesn't know and what their experience is like without having them as a client in front of me really telling their story. So if people even just want help or want clarity or want to input, ideas for me to talk about, I'm really big on adding value. And so the best way for somebody to support me and add value to me is let me know how I can support them.
That's incredible. I'll have all of your links linked down in the show notes below so people can stay in touch. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and all of your tips with us today, Marcus.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It was an honor. Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning into another episode of Nourished Inside Out. I'm so thankful that you're here. Your support means so much, and I'm so excited to bring to you our very first Nourished Inside Out live virtual summit on April 26th and 27th. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, and pre-sale for tickets will be for a limited time. You can find the link in the show notes below for more information. See you there. And as always, keep growing and thriving.